On this channel, I talk a lot about investing through stocks, shares, and property as well. And in this video, I'm going to share with you my top 5 mistakes and regrets on my very first buy-to-let property. Let's jump straight in with number 1. Firstly is choosing the wrong solicitor before I've actually chosen the lender. Now, I know what you're thinking, Matt, how on earth can you choose the wrong solicitor? Well, when you're buying a property in your own personal name through the residential market, usually, in most cases, a lot of those lenders, even if you go through a broker, are going to be the big named retail banks. They're going to be very popular names that everyone's heard of, and the big mainstream lenders. And this means that a lot of the solicitors in the UK, either through their own independent applications or they essentially join a panel, they can act for those lenders, and it's that common and that widespread that you don't even have to think about it as a buyer. It will never cross your mind because your solicitor will be on the panel in 99% of the cases for that lender. That means that that lender trusts that solicitor's firm or group or whatever you want to call it. They trust them to manage the money, to manage the sale, to flag if there are any potential issues on the property that they're not aware of, which would impact their ability to lend on the property, and they essentially dual represent both you and the bank dealing with the legal process on both sides of getting that mortgage to pay for the house that you're buying. However, the lender that I went for on my buy-to-let was Kent Reliance. Now, I was buying the buy-to-let in a limited company which is owned by a holding company, so it's in a group structure and it's a little bit more complex, albeit not impossible. So when I applied to Kent Reliance after choosing them as my final lender, I'd already chosen the solicitors beforehand. They were beginning the searches and starting to go through the buy-to-let process. The problem was that Kent Reliance didn't have my solicitor on their panel. In fact, they only had around 7 to 8 solicitors on their entire panel, which is a really small subsection. The problem with that is that unless you're really lucky at choosing solicitors, it means that I was using a solicitor who wasn't on the panel of the lender and therefore couldn't proceed and use them. Essentially what the lender wanted was dual representation both for me buying the house and the lender using the solicitor, and it all goes to the same person. So the problem is here, I had to de-instruct my solicitors, take the searches that they'd done, and then hand it over to a brand new solicitor who was on the panel, who was a little bit more expensive. But then it meant changing the sales memorandum, telling the seller of the property what had happened as well, and trying to make sure I was keeping everything together. It did cause small delays, and it wasn't the worst mistake in the world, but I just had no idea that this was a thing that I needed to consider. Secondly is underestimating the refurbishment costs. Now, if you've seen the full playlist and series that I've done on the buy-to-let, you'll notice that as the series goes through, the numbers change quite drastically over time. Originally, when I bought the property and analysed the deal, I had worked out and budgeted around £10,000 to do a refurb on the property. This was to cosmetically do it up, to paint it, to change all the carpets, put in a new bathroom, and I was going to salvage the kitchen by respraying the cupboards, giving it a really deep clean and putting in a new floor and new tiling, and it should have looked okay. The problem was that when we got into the property on the very first day, I noticed that there was a cigarette burn in the laminate worktop, so I just couldn't use the laminate, couldn't reuse that, couldn't recycle it. The oven as well, I forgot to look inside during the viewing. It was disgusting. It was beyond cleanable. It just wasn't something you could reuse. So it was easier to just rip everything out and start again. Behind the kitchen was loads of rat droppings. It was clearly infested. So it just wasn't worth salvaging the kitchen. This meant spending a few extra £1,000s. The second big area of this where I got it wrong with the refurbishment was that when I was viewing the property and I looked around, in my head I remember having double glazed windows. I remember opening a double glazed window just to check out the back. When we were halfway through buying the property, I was looking on Google Street View and I noticed all of a sudden on the front of the property that some of the windows were single glazed, and I was really confused behind this. What the property had was a mixture of both double glazed and single glazed, but because in my head I had seen a double glazed window, I assumed the whole house had exactly the same, apart from the front and the back door, which I knew was single glazed timber. Now that's not a normal thing. It's very rare to have a house that has a mixture of double and single glazed, because clearly somebody has done half a job. Now, the problem with that is that it meant replacing 7 or 8 windows and 2 doors, which meant there was an extra £3,500 on top of that to get all of those replaced. Now, I'm a huge fan of doing the job properly and getting it done, so it was definitely money well spent. But this meant that adding the whole kitchen, a little bit more in electrics, and as well looking after all the double glazing and the 2 doors, the price went from £10,000 up to £17,000, which is almost double. It's a 70% increase. Now, in reality, this worked out okay because the property market in the area has been really hot. And when I originally analysed the property, all the sold comparables in the area were around £130,000 to £135,000. It was almost going to be a break-even project. By the time I'd finished, and fast forward a few more months, it's now worth about £175,000 with loads of sold comparables to back that up, which I didn't expect. I knew at the time that the prices were going up, so that's why I made the decision that it's okay to spend the money. If the project was in a flat or declining market, I think I would have reconsidered exactly what I put in the property and tried to stick to that 10k as much as possible, because there's nothing more dangerous than eating into what is most of your profit if you're working on a really small scale buy-to-let refurb. So my lesson learned from that isn't really about analysing properties and making sure that I'm accurate on my costings, it's just making sure I'm more accurate on what I scope into the refurb and allowing a certain budget for some more of the unknowns. Next is a mistake that I never saw coming and had no idea about, which is also why I decided to do the renovations mostly myself, so I could learn a lot of this process. And the big mistake I got wrong during the refurb was doing the joinery and all of the woodwork just after plastering while everything in the house was still drying. This is a big no-no, and you really want to think about humidity when you're doing any renovation project in your own home or in a buy-to-let investment project. The main problem is that the plasterer had just finished and he'd plastered everything in the house. We did almost, I'd say, half to 60% of the house completely reboarded and replastered from scratch, which meant that the house was very wet, it was very humid. You often see after you do this kind of thing that there's a lot of condensation on the windows, and that's a sign that the house is drying out. The problem is that I booked the joiner 2 days after the plasterer had finished. I was keeping a really tight ship and a really tight schedule. The problem is that the joiner came in, did a fantastic job, and he fit around 8 or 9 doors in the property as well as skirting. The next day, I got into the property and none of the doors would fit back into the door frames whatsoever. It was like he'd tried to fit them, but hadn't bothered chopping them down whatsoever, which is even more difficult in a 1950s build council fitted house where you've got wonky walls and wonky architraves all over the place. The reason why this is a big problem is that when you introduce loads of dry wood into a very humid, wet house, it essentially acts like a sponge. So all of these completely bone dry 8 doors soaked up everything like a sponge, which meant that they warped, they changed size. So every single door pretty much had to be cut down again to fit back into the door frame. So that was a massive lesson learned. Thankfully, the carpenter didn't charge me for it because I spotted it the next morning, got him back in, and then he just gave everything a quick shave again on the doors to make sure they fit. But that's something that I'm going to remember for the next project, is to make sure the house is dry before adding any woodwork or joinery into it. Next is not properly planning the layout of the entire renovation project. Now, if you've seen the series and the playlist, you'll see that I did do this. I planned out the house, I measured every single wall, and I even had 3D visual renders and walkthroughs where I could put the camera in the property and virtually walk through every single room. The problem is, even this wasn't detailed enough. We had quite a big problem in the kitchen. So going back to overspending, the original plan meant that we weren't going to be changing the kitchen around. By the time we got in the property, we decided to rip out the kitchen and restart again. And as a part of the change in the kitchen, we moved the sink a little bit more over to the right, which added more space between that and the electric hob for building regulations. Now, the problem with this is that it meant moving the taps and everything else with it. There were 2 issues. When I gave my plumber the plan, he moved all the pipes, he did everything correct, but he didn't move the stopcock from its original location, which meant it was behind the sink originally, the old sink, but then in the new layout, without changing the stopcock, that would mean that it would be behind the oven. And for some reason, my plumber wasn't proactive enough to think about this. So even though he moved all of the pipes for the taps and put them in the right place and measured it properly, he just didn't bother to move the stopcock, which meant when I was fitting the kitchen, I had no way of properly turning off the water. And it's not easy for a tenant just to take the oven out of the cupboard and turn off the stopcock. And then secondly, there's a plug that was then right above the sink, which we had to then completely plaster up and get rid of and plug it all up and move it to the right, which meant paying more electric work and having to replan some of the kitchen layout at the very, very last minute. Now, the way to get around this is that when you're designing and creating a renovation project, you should map out every single switch, plug, light and any electrical item whatsoever, as well as thinking about your plumbing, where are all the taps going to go, and especially where is the stopcock going to go in the property, because our workaround was to have an isolation valve under the sink rather than the actual stopcock. It's either that or they have to go out into the street and change the street stopcock, which also affects multiple houses, so that's not the most ideal solution. And lastly, isn't something that's a massive mistake or anything I got majorly wrong, it's just more of a hindsight observation, and this is Regretting not getting started earlier, I set up the company and it took about a year from then to actually getting an offer accepted. Now, part of that was down to COVID, which is fine, but it was a lot of learning, listening to podcasts, reading magazines, watching YouTube videos, instead of getting out there, viewing properties and making offers. And I think a lot of people get stuck in this rut of studying a little bit too much and not taking action to get started, purely out of fear or not feeling ready. And the reality is, I don't think you'll ever quite feel ready. You just have to jump into it head first and just get going. A lot of people even view a lot of properties but then make no offers. If you're not making offers, you're not going to have a chance of getting one accepted. So you have to be in it to win it. It's like having a lottery ticket. If you don't have the lottery tickets, you don't have the offers on properties, then there's absolutely zero chance of progressing forwards. And now that I've done it once, I learned a ton from that whole project. I can't wait to get into the next one, and we've had an offer accepted on a personal house, which is going to be a huge renovation project, as well as then working towards the next company project, which I think is going to be a student HMO. The reality is everything is figure outable, and no matter what the problem is, the whole thing is just problem solving. So get in there, get stuck in, and don't be afraid of getting started. And there you have it, my top 5 mistakes and regrets on my very first buy-to-let project. If you enjoyed this and found it useful, then check out the playlist here, which goes through the full planning, the rendering, and the renovation process of the buy-to-let from start to finish in about 10 to 15 videos. So check it out here, and I will see you in this playlist.